Welcome to Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine's fiction podcast. I'm Janet Hutchings, EQMM's editor. Since her debut with EQMM in May of 2000, Marilyn Todd has sold 37 stories to our magazine, making her one of our most prolific current contributors. She has also become a favorite author for many EQMM readers, who voted her a Reader's Award Scroll in 2013. A British writer who has resided in France for many years, Marilyn Todd's specialty is the historical mystery, and she has penned 16 published novels in series set in ancient Rome and in ancient Greece. Her short stories run the gamut from entries in the ancient Roman and Greek series to more modern settings. For our podcast this month, we have a reading by Mandie Davis of one of Marilyn Todd's contemporary tales set in France, The Old Man and the Seashore, from the January 2016 issue of EQMM.
Eyes that were once blacker than night were now cloudy. Hands that used to wring a chicken's neck in one snap merely quivered. Corded muscles hung slack. They used to be afraid of him, children. The big man living in the blue-painted shack on the shore. Jules le Géant, they called him. Jules the Giant. In the early days, when he first took up residence on the edge of town, arriving in his shabby little boat with just one even shabbier suitcase and a bag slung across his shoulder, a group of them, mostly boys, would creep up, dare one of the number to shin over the fence, knock on his door, and then run. This only happened 3 or 4 times. The next time he heard them sniggering, shing, building up the bravado, he was ready. When the first knuckle rapped, he flung the door open and roared at the top of his lungs. Occasionally, some of the older boys would taunt him with chants, but only at night and on the public side of the fence. What they did over there was none of his business. He ignored them. After a while, the children stopped coming. "Where's he from, Henri? What do you know about him? Why did he come here to Barras?" Short, thick-set, with dark, wavy hair and eyebrows that met over the bridge of his nose, Henri Grimaud was the most powerful man between here and La Rochelle. As mayor of the town, he was both the elected authority in the commune and the state's representative in it. He set and managed the budget, was responsible for preserving local heritage, conservation of the environment, and the issue of building permits, as well as being in charge of public health and safety, social issues, and local administration. He officiated at weddings, was registrar of births and deaths, and was entitled to special powers under the authority of the public prosecutor for the repression of crime. To admit he hadn't a clue was unthinkable. "I'm not at liberty to say," he'd reply stiffly. In a country where bureaucracy reigned supreme and required dozens of forms to be filled in triplicate naturally, the mayor knew precisely when and where Duplessis was born. July the 17th, 1948, a fishing village in Brittany. He knew the names of his parents, both long since dead, that Jules had a sister, Marie-Christine, and his trade was listed as carpenter, even though no one had ever seen him work wood or use tools. Monsieur le Maire was also aware that Jules Duplessis had left Brittany 40 years earlier. What he'd done and where he'd been before he washed up in Barras was a mystery, even with all those damned forms. "If you want to know more, you'll have to ask him yourself," he would add, knowing full well that nobody would. So, while the rest of Barras went about its business, raising succulent oysters and fat juicy mussels to ship to Paris, Bordeaux and Lyon, or running hotels and restaurants, or growing fruit and vegetables to sell in the market, or baking hot, flaky croissants and bread sold by the kilo, Jules le Géant kept himself to himself, combing the beach after each tide and selling his finds to the tourists who flocked here in the summer for the endless dunes and gorgeous rocky coves, and a sun that never seemed to set. The tide was a generous benefactor. It donated shells, driftwood, starfish and cuttlefish bones, as you'd expect, along with all manner of flotsam and jetsam, ranging from ropes and chains and other boating equipment to beads and bones, fly swatters, rubber ducks, and once a 1.5 meter tall plastic snowman. One reason Barras was so suited to the mollusk industry was that it was wrapped around a mass of tiny inlets, cuts, streams and canals, all tidal, all ripe for a beachcomber's pickings. Also, the cliffs themselves weren't very high, 2 or 3 meters, no more, but the rocks below were unusual. Like the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, how appropriate, they resembled large cobblestones, and the Golfe de Gascon, what English visitors called Biscay, wasn't famous for its tranquil nature. In winter, February in particular, wild storms swept in from the Atlantic to batter the coast, and often, after a heavy tidal surge, the good folk of Barras would wake up to find another cobblestone gone. Left behind in the holes was anything too heavy, too awkward, or too pointy to wash out again. Irons, pans and gears lodged and became trapped, along with anchors, daggers, dumbbells, tyres. Statues of the Virgin Mary were unaccountably common. With 10 full months between the end of one tourist season and the beginning of the next, Jules' collection of chipped, dented, barnacle-encrusted objects grew to the point where it no longer fitted under the awning that ran along the back of his fence, but spread across the rough patch of ground that passed for a garden, virtually encroaching on the cracked, narrow path that led to his door. Honestly, you wouldn't believe what people forget, abandon, discard, or simply lose after a day on the beach. Toys, sneakers, blouses, umbrellas, mugs, picnic baskets, towels, necklaces, bracelets and rings, to name but a few. But you know what they say. One man's junk is another man's keepsake. It's amazing what people buy when they're having fun. Is that a narwhal tooth? Jules glanced round from his baguette. With her thick blonde hair, white blouse and cut-off jeans, the girl seemed vaguely familiar. Yes. Twisted pipe, narwhal tooth, what did it matter? By the time someone pointed out the mistake, assuming anyone did, she'd been miles away, in Rouen or Limoges, or wherever these people came from. Leaning with his back against the wall, he carried on munching. How much is it? 5 euros. Sounds cheap. They must be common round here. On a scale of 1 to 100, whales from the Arctic Circle ranked as, are you taking the piss? Fairly. He sliced off another chunk of saucisson sec and balanced it on his baguette. That little snub nose, definitely familiar, but he still couldn't place her. Most likely a tourist from last year back to explore the mussel beds or feast on the oysters. Back end of September, with the air calm and the sun's strength still fierce, they were coming into their own. A feature restaurateurs took advantage of, remaining open right through the year. Unlike most coastal resorts, when the shutters came down the first day the schools went back, turning the place into a ghost town. This is pretty. The girl had abandoned the lump of old pipe in favour of a blue china pig painted with tiny pink flowers. Not every item on sale had been washed up or forgotten. After the locals became aware of his collection, they began turning up with armfuls of unwanted china, glassware, all manner of bric-a-brac. Jules never bought. He wasn't in this for the money. All he needed was enough to get by, keep his head down, and not to have to mix. Perhaps they felt sorry for him, this big shambling recluse. Perhaps they were curious. Perhaps they were too lazy to take their damn junk to the tip. Either way, some of the locals had taken to leaving various bits and bobs at the gate. Perhaps they meant well. Who cares? 2 euros. Sell stuff cheap enough and cash soon starts to stack up. My sister and I used to have piggy banks like this when we were little. This was an ornament, not a piggy bank. He chewed on his sausage, pulled off another chunk of baguette. Clear plastic ours were, though, with the competition for who's filled up the quickest. The girl's smile was wistful. I won hands down every time, but I wish now I hadn't. She put the china pig back where she'd found it. I'd cheat by swapping large denominations for heaps of centimes. Having eaten enough, Big Hands carefully wrapped the saucisson back in its greaseproof paper, sealing the remainder of the baguette in a linen bag to keep it fresh to feed to the gulls. Leave bread in the open air around here, and in an hour's time it's harder than, well, narwhal teeth. I got away with it, see, because she's 4 years younger than me. Blue eyes filled with tears. Arlette. That's her name, you know. Arlette. He took a swig of cider. Brute. Couldn't stand the sweet stuff. Wiped his hands down the sides of his trousers. The house is off limits. She looked surprised, and he couldn't decide whether it was because he'd jolted her out of her own little world, or because he'd referred to the tumble-down shack as a house. Oh, is it? Sorry. There were hundreds, thousands of cabins like this around here, lining the canals, edging the inlets, all with some kind of mooring for boats. Some stood on stilts, some were stone-built, but most of them were timber constructions with tiled pitched roofs, all of them bigger than they appeared from the outside. Oystermen's cabins. A feature of the region, and a photographer's dream, being brightly painted and every one so utterly different from its neighbour. Orange with green doors and blue windows, blue with canary yellow doors and red windows, pale pink with red doors, dark blue, light blue, red stripes, two-tone, ramshackle, rustic, chic. Some were beside jetties, others next to pontoons and piers, and others, like Jules's, isolated with just a post in the water to tie up to. Although uninhabited for the most part, some owners grew tall spikes of hollyhocks at the front, or planters bursting with sweet-scented herbs. A few of the cabins had been lovingly decorated with murals, a few more turned into gift shops, and one enterprising soul had actually linked 4 together to form a restaurant with a terrace at the edge of the water. Flat-bottomed boats constantly chugged up and down the channels, bringing in baskets of oysters to serve with white wine, crusty bread, and a lemon. The smell of salt carried heavy on the breeze. Gulls screamed as they wheeled overhead. Only I thought I saw some crucifixes among the clutter inside. It's not clutter. Jules snapped the door shut. That's stock I haven't got round to cleaning up. Maybe she was a day tripper who'd stopped by once before, and that's how he knew her. Lord knows they were plentiful enough. Artists attracted by the views to Fort Boyard out at sea, walkers hiking the open coastal path, casual diners stopping for moule frite in one of the many waterside restaurants. Like summer tourists, a lot of them liked to pick up a souvenir before heading home and back to work the next day. One of the crucifixes looked shiny and new. Things get dropped. Shouldn't you hand them in to the police? Why? Teaches people to be more careful in future. Are you buying that? What would I want with a garden gnome that's lost its fishing rod? The snub nose wrinkled in distaste. I'll take the china pig, though. €3. I thought you said 2. 3. An extra euro for wasting his time. She went missing. The girl dug out a €5 note. Arlette. 2 change. Last summer it was. She rubbed the pig's back as though for good luck. Barra was the last place she was seen. Holiday romance, most like, or run off with one of the gypsies. They're fine-looking boys. That's what the police said. Probably backpacking round Australia right this moment, they said, having a whale of a time. Would they know what they're talking about? I suppose so. She stared at the pig. Only Arlette wasn't like that. Why would she go off without letting me know? Jules stared at the big shambling shadow on the side of the hut and said nothing. What, after all, was there to say? Our parents died in a crash 5 years ago. All we have is each other. She's young. Young people are impulsive. The police said that too. The girl blew into a tissue. See it all the time, they said. Students working the summer to pay for university. Itinerant lifestyle becomes seductive. They meet like-minded souls, lose track of time, think keeping in touch doesn't matter. Feeling that he was expected to make some reply, Duplessis grunted. They asked how long before she disappeared since you spoke. She flicked her blonde hair over her shoulder. Like 4 or 5 weeks meant we weren't close. Of course Arlette followed the work. We both did. Sometimes it was the vineyards, sometimes waiting tables, but we kept in touch when we could. You'd have heard if there was bad news. Or so everyone tells me. Bad news travels fast, but I thought, if I came here, saw where she worked, talked to people she mixed with. Her face clouded. The trouble is, no one remembers Arlette. Not clearly. It was high season, not like today. In July and August the town was overrun with thousands, literally thousands of tourists, and thousands of tourists meant casual labour, all paid in cash, no questions asked, and no records. He shrugged. Employers can't be expected to keep track of every kid who comes passing through. I know, it was a long shot, I understand that, but I still had to take it. She patted the garish china ornament. Thanks for your time. He watched her close the gate behind her. Sure he'd seen her somewhere before. Here. He tossed her a euro coin, which she caught. You were right. The pig cost €2, not 3. Sunset. Another reason why artists and photographers flocked to the Atlantic coast. The incredible spectacle of nature, reddening the sky, colouring the cliffs, turning the sea to molten copper. Terns made their last dives of the day for fish. Bats squeaked on the wing. Gulls flapped languidly across the fiery horizon to their roost. Jules the giant sighed. Soon the cranes and the storks would be heading south again. The hoopoes would be on their way to Africa, ditto the warblers and the swallows, and before long the first slight chill of autumn would creep into the evening air. He listened to the waves washing soft against the shoreline, waves that brought him gifts on every tide, and with them the freedom to be himself and to do the things he liked to do, accountable to no one, responsible for nothing, obligated to nobody but himself. This was how it had always been, the big awkward man who had been the big awkward kid at school. An outsider then, an outsider now. He wouldn't have it any other way. As the sun dipped and the sky darkened, Duplessis remained motionless, staring across the ocean into space. The only sounds were the wind singing in the dunes and the gentle splash of lapping water, hypnotic and comforting. The garden had become so overgrown with junk that it was on the cusp of becoming a talking point, a quirky landmark for tourists to check out, an object of curiosity for curiosity's sake. He'd seen it happen before. Too many people, too much talk. This was the end of the season in every sense. Duplessis waited until the light faded. Inside his shack, he flicked on a light and pulled his suitcase down from the shelf. Like the first hint of autumn, old age was also creeping up. Arms that used to lift 3 times his body weight without breaking sweat could barely lift half that these days. Hands that could lock a vice-like grip for 20 minutes, just about managed 10. Where he'd been able to haul on the oars all day long if he'd needed, was reduced to 3 hours at best. Stacking his meagre possessions into the case, he had no regrets. Change was inevitable, especially for drifters. Jules lived his life his way, on his own terms. How many men could say that? Boots, papers, sweaters, vests, he was an expert at packing, never sorry to leave when it became the time to move on. Clearing space on the click-clack that doubled as a sofa and bed, he picked up the crucifix. Of course. That's why the girl looked familiar. In his giant paw, the necklace seemed lost. He remembered her now. Same snub nose, but brown hair, not blonde, not quite as skinny either, and her eyes, they weren't blue. No, they were green. Jules remembered exactly how green they were, bulging with terror as his hands closed round her throat, again and again and again. He picked up the box he kept next to his pillow. Inside were 58 other necklaces, mementos of his travels around the French coast. Well, who'd have thought it? The sister, eh? Jules climbed into his little boat and shipped the oars. True, he couldn't do all the things today that he used to, but as long as he had the strength to wrap chains around their young naked bodies and dump them way out at sea, life was very good. Silently the rope slipped from its mooring post. Maybe, God willing, he'd bump into the sister again sometime. That was a mighty pretty opal that hung round her neck.
The Old Man on the Seashore is copyrighted by Marilyn Todd. Music for the podcast is by Mario Salisa and was obtained from the community audio section of the Internet Archive. Mixing for the podcast was done by Jackie Sherbo. You can subscribe to Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, where you'll find more stories like this one by visiting our website at www.themysteryplace.com/EQMM.